I'm here with Andrew Briggs. And Andrew has written 3 books that I really like, which we'll talk about. But the main topic is human flourishing. And Andrew, I have a question for you that I figured you probably wouldn't volunteer this because of your British modesty, but John Lennox put me up to it. He said that in the Cavendish laboratory at Cambridge, there is a statement written in Latin that you convinced the faculty to translate in English and also add to the building. And I thought maybe I could get you to explain that sign and explain how you convinced university faculty members to make an English version of it.
Oh, well, that's kind of you to ask. It is actually it's a wonderful story. And it's a very remarkable one. The Cavendish Laboratory was a 19th century foundation. And the laboratory, by the time the laboratory was being built, James Clerk Maxwell had been appointed as the first Cavendish professor. And although James Clerk Maxwell is not known now and was not in his day nearly such a celebrity as Charles Darwin, his influence on our lives has been no less.
Well, every electrical engineer knows who that guy is. Maybe the average person doesn't, but that's high cotton as far as I'm concerned.
He was a deeply committed Christian, and he felt that Christians whose minds were scientific should pay attention to these things. And he cared about every detail of the construction of the Cavendish Laboratory. It was the first purpose-built physics laboratory in either Oxford or Cambridge, actually. And the original Cavendish Laboratory is in Free School Lane in the centre of Cambridge. And the entrance to the courtyard of the laboratory has 2 large oak doors. And across the 2 doors is written a verse. But it is, as you say, in Latin. It's actually in a rather ornate script, so it's quite difficult to read, even if you read Latin. But if you find an ornate script difficult and you don't read Latin, it's quite hard to see what it says. Now, by the time that I went to do my PhD in Cambridge, the physics department had outgrown these original laboratories in the centre of Cambridge and had moved to brand new laboratories in West Cambridge, in a site that actually has become now the major scientific site of Cambridge. The vet school had been there before, but apart from the vet school, which obviously was in farmland, you see, as it then was, the Cavendish was the first of the new laboratories to be put there. And in my first year as a graduate student, I talked to the head of department, and who was Sir Brian Pippard, who was the first person to measure the Fermi surface of copper, the first person to measure the Fermi surface of anything. And I said that I thought it would be wonderful if we could have this inscription that was so important to Maxwell and to the history of the laboratory over the entrance to the new laboratory. And I could see exactly where to put it. There was a good space for it. And I also said that now that not so many physicists read Latin fluently, it might be better to have it in English.
Yeah.
Now, only years later did I learn the full story, which that he put it to the department committee, as indeed he told me that he would. He said he'd put it to the committee and see what they thought. Only years later, I learned from him that he was sure that they'd reject it. So he could come back and say, well, I'm so sorry, Andrew, I put it to the committee, but there was no support for it. But to his astonishment, they warmly supported the idea. Wow. They thought it was a very good idea. And they chose the Coverdale translation, which is a wonderful English translation. And it was carved on a beautiful piece of mahogany by Will Carter. And it's over the entrance of those buildings to this day. In fact, a picture of it forms the frontispiece of my PhD thesis. And it, in the Coverdale translation, it says, "The works of the Lord are great." sought out of all them that have pleasure therein, which is verse 2 of Psalm 111. And I love that because it says that what scientists are doing is finding out how God makes the world work, and it's an enormously pleasurable activity.
Yeah.
And so it's a wonderful, wonderful verse. Of course, sometimes it's hard work and sometimes it's painful, but when you understand for the first time something that has hitherto never been understood, there's a huge joy and pleasure in that.
Absolutely.
Now, there's a couple of extra footnotes to the story. One is that in the Latin translation, the person having the pleasure is God. So in the Latin translation, loosely translated into English, is the Lord's works are great, sought out by everyone according to his pleasure. So the pleasure is God's pleasure in us discovering things.
Yeah.
And we think that that Latin translation is probably an accurate translation of the Greek Septuagint, which itself may be an accurate translation of a Hebrew text that has since got lost. We don't know.
Yes.
But I rather love this sort of both sides of it. That. And the other thing that is striking is the added dimension of pleasure in studying the creation to someone who knows the Creator. So the pleasure of scientific discovery is shared by all scientists, whether or not they know God. There's just a great joy. There's a great joy in learning things that others had already discovered, and there's a sort of extra joy in learning things that no one had previously known. But we've been looking earlier this afternoon at paintings by Roger Wagner, with whom I wrote the penultimate curiosity. Very interestingly, this story is told in that book. In fact, we start and end the book with that story and the equivalent story in Oxford of the Museum of Natural History. And, someone who comes into this house and sees the paintings can get great pleasure from the paintings because they're fabulous paintings. But for me, and to some extent for you, because you've met Roger, when you know the artist and you see their paintings, there's a sort of additional joy because it's in the context of a relationship, and you know the artist and you're learning more about the artist through his expression, through the paintings. And I think that applies also to science discovery, that, as I say, everybody can have the joy of science discovery, but for those who know the Creator, there's an extra dimension of that pleasure, a sort of amplification of it, because of their relationship with the Creator, whose creation they're studying and learning about and understanding in rich ways.
So this is the way that you have chosen to pursue human flourishing in your material science career. And it's how you flourished. And it's also your contribution to humanity, to all the papers and the companies and publications and lectures and disseminating your knowledge. So it kind of suggests that what makes the public flourish is also what makes the scientist flourish.
In the book on human flourishing, which I wrote with Michael Reiss, we offer 3 dimensions of human flourishing, which cannot be separated, but they can be distinguished for the purposes of thinking about them and talking about them.
Yeah.
The first dimension is the material dimension, because it's hard to flourish if you haven't got adequate food and clothing and housing and access to healthcare and education. And, however you measure flourishing, if you start from 0 material goods, it increases quite steeply as you gain more material goods. But it also saturates quite quickly, actually, and depending on whose studies you look at and what numbers, after people are earning about the equivalent of $50,000 or so. Yeah. their desire to get more money doesn't diminish, but the addition to their flourishing does diminish after that amount. Then a second dimension is the relational dimension, because it's not good for humans to be alone. We need cooperation in society, and we've evolved for cooperation in society. Solitary confinement is a terrible punishment, which is why it's outlawed for more than 2 weeks. So we need relationships. But then, even when those two are adequately satisfied, or even if they're not adequately satisfied, there's a third dimension, and we struggle to know what to call it. In the end, we called it the transcendent dimension. And what we meant by that is this sort of sense that the more, particularly the more you study the physical world in science, as I do in my laboratory, but also the more you learn about people and life and so on, the more you find this world calling us out to something beyond itself, so that there's a sort of extra spiritual dimension to human flourishing, without which life is, in my opinion, spiritually impoverished. And different people experience this in different ways. Some people experience it in nature or sunset. A lot of people experience it in music. We've just been experiencing it in paintings, or poetry, or literature. And for many people, the transcendent dimension either has a spiritual element or is a spiritual thing. And so not for everyone, but for many people, this transcendent dimension finds its fulfillment in a relationship with God. So those are the sort of 3 dimensions of human flourishing we look at. And I suppose, you're right that, of course, doing science research is a fully material thing. It's also a fully relational thing, because although you can do certain bits of mathematics and certain experiments all by yourself, that's rather rare in modern science. And anyway, science, one of the aspects of science is that it's open to scrutiny, which is by definition a social thing.
It's a very social thing.
So that's formalized in peer review, but there are all sorts of informal ways in which scrutiny of science takes place. So that it's got a material dimension, it's got a relational dimension, but in ways that I've just been describing. I think it has a transcendent dimension as well. And I think that many people could recognize this. It happens that a neighbor here, a former pupil of my mother's, is Andrew Wiles, who proved Fermat's last theorem, which had been around for 350 years, begging a proof.
You know that guy.
We shared a Cambridge childhood.
Wow. Okay. That's impressive.
And he was one of several actually very distinguished mathematicians who learned from my mother. But for him, that was a transcendent experience. I think he'd be happy for me to describe it that way when he finally saw how to do the proof.
So you've got lots of irons in the fire in many projects, and sitting down and writing an entire book about human flourishing, that doesn't happen by accident. There had to be some itch that you really needed to scratch for yourself, I guess, for you to sit down and focus on a book like this and explore this topic so deeply. Like, what provoked you to do this?
Well, there's a sense in which the whole of life prompted me to do it. So you'll see that in the book there are quotations from a lifetime of reading in science, but beyond science as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I particularly enjoyed writing it with Michael Reiss. We enjoyed writing it together because we found that we'd read enough in common that we knew what each other was talking about, but we'd also read enough, distinctively, that each of us could contribute from our own background. It was triggered by the fact that at the time I was looking after the grant making of one of the 3 Templeton foundations. And we were having a review of, given the resources available to distribute in ways that were consistent with donor intent, where could we make the greatest impact? What would do the most good? And the more we talked about it, the more we felt, well, if we could use some of these resources to promote human flourishing, that would be really significant. But then as we looked at it, we thought, well, actually, whenever anybody is thinking about or talking about something that really matters to them, is really important to them, the chances are they're talking about some aspect of human flourishing. And so that provided a sort of trigger to want to bring some of these things together. And there was another aspect of it too, which was that having delineated these three dimensions of human flourishing, the question naturally arises, well, what is the basis of human flourishing? Is it just suspended in midair with no visible means of support? Or are there some pillars that support it?
Mm-hmm.
And there are, and we chose to segment it in terms of the three pillars of truth and purpose and meaning. Because you can't flourish if it's a life based on lies, and it's hard to flourish if you're purposeless. And I don't think anybody would want to say they were living a meaningless life. And as we looked at those, it became clear that each of them in its own way depends on a very subtle combination of objective reality and choices to be made. And this sort of comes as a surprise to some people, particularly when you talk about truth, you start with it, and they say, quoting others, well, Andrew, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts.
Right.
I'm a passionate realist. I passionately believe there is a reality out there that we seek to describe. Nevertheless, it's also the case that we make choices about where we're going to look for truth and what intellectual tools are we going to deploy in seeking truth. And so these choices are very important ones that we make, and they affect the truth that we find and the way that we seek to articulate it. And one way of illustrating it, well, people often illustrate it with maps. A map that's good for finding your way around the streets may not be good for aviation. So you need a different kind of map. And it's not that one is true and the other one's false. It's that they're suitable for different purposes.
Yeah.
And similarly with science, it's often not very useful to ask whether, for example, Newton's laws, are they true or false? All right. It's more useful, it's more helpful to say, for what purposes are they sufficiently true?
Yep.
And for designing automobiles, Newton's laws will do you very nicely, thank you. But if you're trying to design a global navigation system, then they're not adequate, and you need to go beyond that to Einstein's relativity. And so you can ask the question, is a particular science theory sufficiently true to be useful? But then you're begging the question, because you say, well, useful for what? Useful for what purpose?
Yes. Yeah.
And the purpose is something we choose, which goes on to the next chapter, But even when we're choosing purposes, we're also mindful of the objective facts. I love it when people ask, say, well, I'm trying to find the purpose for my life. I love that. And at its best, that means they're trying to think, what are their talents? What are the opportunities they've got? What are the things they're good at? And so on.
Yeah.
But having considered all those things, they may just have to make a choice. Many of us could have more than one purpose in our lives, or different purposes at different moments in our lives. So that's a combination of objective reality and choice. And when it comes to meaning, of course, meaning is all about the interaction between if it's a creative work or something, and the person looking at it. So we were looking at Roger's paintings earlier on. And if you say, what's the meaning of that painting? Well, that's got to be an interactive question. You've got to look at it and think about it and reflect on it and see what impact it has on you. And so with many other kinds of things as well. So these are all a subtle interplay between the objective reality and the choices we make about how to respond to that reality.
And you're weaving these together. And one thing I've noticed about 3 of your books, Penultimate Curiosity and It Keeps Me Seeking and Human Flourishing, is they are all spiritual books, but they are all directed in a way that does not make a lot of assumptions about the audience. And it's definitely not a preaching to the choir type of a book. These books are intended for anybody who's a thinking person, and they do not presume a particular religious perspective. And so you're backfilling, you're stating assumptions that oftentimes would just be assumed and not stated. And you're politely defending them as well.
It's rather pleasing, actually. If you look, for example, at It Keeps Me Seeking, on the inside cover, there are endorsements from Rolf Hoyer, who is one of the world's most powerful scientists. He was director of the world's biggest experiment for a number of years at CERN. And he's someone who's very respectful of religious commitment without himself necessarily sharing it. And then Justin Welby, who, as Archbishop of Canterbury, has a religious commitment without necessarily having a scientific background. But they've each said more or less the same thing about the book. So Rolf Hoyer says, a rallying call for the quest to find meaning in both the physical and the spiritual planes to join hands. And Justin Welby says, a truly beautiful invitation to look at how science and faith can work together to further our desire for God. And if you look at Human Flourishing, the endorsements, then there's a mixture of believers and people who wouldn't call themselves believers, each of whom has something positive to say about the book.
So I would categorize this as a demilitarized zone kind of a book.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, so between North and South Korea, there's a band of land a couple miles wide where nobody's allowed to shoot each other. In a spiritual conversation, this is a place where people are invited to have a dialogue where we're not assuming anything in particular about what you're bringing to the dialogue, and we are expecting everyone to be peaceful and congenial in that conversation. Like there's not a sense of we're having a debate here.
I think that's right. But if I can change the metaphor, I want to move away from the tennis court metaphor. So the tennis court picture has science on one side of the net and knowing God on the other side of the net. And the two opponents are hitting the ball at each other. And they're each trying to make the other one make a mistake so that they can win the point, you see. I want to get away from that. I want to think of the sort of activities I enjoy more, which are, just last week with my grandchildren, we were sailing. It's a sailing boat. You're all trying to work together. You may have different roles. You may have different degrees of knowledge and expertise and so on, but you're all trying to sail the boat as well as you can together. And it feels much more like that to me, that it's one activity with a shared goal where we each have different roles to play and different contributions to make.
So how do you feel that the need for this book has increased since you published it?
Oh, if you look at the subtitle, okay, the subtitle is Scientific Insight and Spiritual Wisdom in Uncertain Times. Now, when we agreed that title with Oxford University Press, which must have been about 6 years ago, we could see that the times were becoming uncertain. We had no idea.
So this is pre-COVID.
We had no idea how uncertain they were going to become. Absolutely none. It was pre-COVID and pre some other characters in the world we could mention at the
moment. Right.
And I think the uncertainty has increased hugely. And one of the things that we say is that, we want to give people, of course, we want to provoke questions. We want to help people to think about these things, think about what I want. What do I want my life to be? How do I want to flourish? Much more important, how do I want others to flourish? How do I think of flourishing not just as me as an individual or any other individual for that matter, but the community to flourish? The community that I'm in, or maybe I'm not in, but nevertheless I can contribute to. And we want people to be stimulated to think that through and to come up with ways of contributing to human flourishing that are robust against the vicissitudes of these uncertainties in which we're experiencing what at the moment seems to be like sort of escalating rate.
What kind of conversations are you noticing that you're having now that's different than the conversations than you were having 4 or 5 years ago about the same subject material?
That's a very good question. I suppose top of the list, at least for me, just at the moment, is conversations about AI. That AI is disrupting, what one might mistakenly have thought was a stable world in new ways and on an industrialized scale. We have a dining club here at Oxford where we meet to talk about these things. And a few weeks back, we had a guest speaker he and his wife are entrepreneurs from New York, and they identify 3 disruptions that occurred to humanity. One was the invention of agriculture 10 or 12,000 years ago. The second was the Industrial Revolution, the 18th and 19th centuries. And they identify the third revolution as AI. Now, I think actually there have been other big changes as well. The invention of writing, you might say, was a pretty significant one, and others as well. But I understand their point. I understand what they're trying to say. It is disruptive. And in fact, some of us just on Thursday last week released a paper on AI and quantum computing and the effect they're going to have on each other. Because when they eventually become, readily available to users, which might be in 5 or 10 years' time, we shall see, quantum computers are going to introduce whole new ways of computing that will, for certain purposes, vastly exceed anything that current computers can do. The one that attracted a lot of funding was code breaking, cryptanalysis. And that may come one day, but I think on a bigger scale, one of the places to look for where quantum computing might be disruptive is in optimization. That's not for sure. Other people may have different opinions, but it seems to me to be a very strong candidate. And quantum computers may enable optimization and a combination of optimization and AI in ways, hitherto unseen. So now you ask the question, well, what are you trying to optimize? What is it that you want to optimize? If you've got this amazing powers of optimization calculations, what would you want to optimize? How much money you make? That might be what some people try to do. It might be what some corporations try to do. And there's a very poignant ancient description of the love of money as being like a snare. And the point about a snare is that you don't realize you're going to be caught until it's too late. So you think of a rabbit in the forest, and there's a wire snare. And when the rabbit triggers it, the wire gets around its leg. And the more the rabbit tries to pull, the tighter the grip of the snare wire is, the more it cuts into his flesh. But it's a snare, he can't get away from it. Now, have you ever seen people for whom money has acted like that?
Absolutely.
So
I'm an entrepreneur.
that's what you set the machine to optimize. That's might be what you get. You might get an optimized snare.
Yeah.
So then you think, well, no, I'm much too sensible for that. So now we stop and think, and what I'd like to think is that we seek to optimize it for human flourishing. And if you say, well, that's just blah, 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 that's just words, the whole point about the book is it's trying to make it not just blah, 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 but it's trying actually to give some content and thought to that.
So it sounds like the more technological we get, the more mastery we need of the humanities and the transcendent in order to not get strung up by our own desires.
I think that's exactly right. There was a time when the humanities were under threat. And people said, well, even the sciences need humanities because they need people to be able to write good English and so on. Well, that's true. But the humanities are important for much bigger reasons than that.
Oh, heavens, yes.
And so, one of the things one wants to do, I'm sort of conscious with grandchildren at the moment as they're growing up, is I wouldn't want to protect them from having to make choices. And I wouldn't want to make the choices for them. But I do hope that we can give them the wherewithal that will enable them, when the time comes, to make good choices for themselves.
What were you most frustrated with? Like, what condition in the world was bothering you the most that you felt writing a flourishing book would contribute to making it better?
That's a very good question. I'm afraid that this is one of those rare occasions when it's good to start with the answer me.
Okay. You can do that.
What's the biggest frustration in the world? I am. Yeah.
Okay. Explain.
Well, that I cause problems. So I cause problems to myself and I cause problems to other people. I don't want to, but it seems to happen. So, if we're talking about human flourishing, then it starts with me, because actually I'm the only person I can change.
Yeah.
But I don't want that to sound too egocentric. And certainly, as I was saying earlier, it's not just about me flourishing, but it's about those I love flourishing. And I think it's wise to say that there should be no limits to who we love, and therefore who we want to flourish. That should not be a limited go on. And I think, too, the trend is towards thinking not only about individuals flourishing, but about communities flourishing. I think that's a healthier way to think of it. One of the great thinkers about human flourishing is at Harvard, Tyler Vanderbilt. He's probably the world's greatest authority on the metrology of human flourishing.
Oh,
he has
okay.
a massive program on it. I think it's about a $43 million program at the minute.
Wow.
On a global study of human flourishing. And of course, a very important aspect of that is the contextuality of human flourishing. How does it differ in different societies, different cultures, different parts of the world? And one of the movements in his work has been a movement building on a very strong base of individuals flourishing to now thinking about the metrology of communities flourishing. And I'm very glad that he's done that, and I think he'll do it extremely well. He already is beginning to.
What do you make of there's been last couple of years, I've read that there's been a sharp rise in church attendance in the UK that nobody was necessarily anticipating. What do you think that has to do with this?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think the observation is correct. And one of the people who's done very good metrology of this is at Reiss University, Elaine Howard-Eklund. And she's done a lot of the surveys of what people believe, what scientists believe. And if you look at her, well, I first came across her because Times Higher Education asked me to review a book she'd written called Science versus Religion. And so I wrote my review, and then Times Higher Ed wrote to me and said, "Oh, we've decided to upgrade this book to Book of the Week. And our convention is that the review of Book of the Week is always a positive review of it." So I wrote a second review.
Oh.
And there was plenty that was very positive to say about it. It's a very important book. But one of the things that you saw there, and it was mainly about scientists she'd surveyed at American elite universities, was that many more of them described themselves as spiritual than described themselves as having a religious commitment.
Yeah.
So I think that trend, by and large, turned out to continue. That while only a limited number might say, yes, I'm religiously committed, or give some evidence that they pray regularly or read the Bible regularly or attend church regularly or equivalents in other faith traditions. Many, many more of them, in fact, the majority, would describe themselves as spiritual people. Now, I think what's happened is that appetite, which manifested itself in people wanting to describe themselves as spiritual, can't be supported in a vacuum. And so they're beginning to find actually they have to give content to that appetite for spirituality. And people can give it content to it in different ways. But I think one of the ways that people are giving content to it is, as you say, by committing themselves to Christian community, in other words, a church community, and belonging to a church and attending a church. And I would certainly say for myself that, as a member of St. Andrew's Church here in Oxford, that the church services are a pivotal part of my church commitment, but they're only a part. And it's actually belonging to this wonderful community and worshiping with them and sharing so many other things with them and praying with them that gives a richness to my relationship with God and my experience of God. And maybe that's what others are beginning to find as well.
Mm. So in your Keeps Me Seeking book, there's a poem that you read me before we started recording. And you explained the painting that's on the cover. And you could say that it's a poem about flipping, not flourishing, to flourishing in a master stroke. I'm wondering if you could explain the painting and the cover in the poem, and then maybe we can tie this all together.
Oh, well, this is going to test my powers of description of something that would be much easier if we were all standing in front of the painting. The painting is by the artist Roger Wagner, who I'd written a previous book with called The Penultimate Curiosity.
Which is a great book, by the way. I really liked that book.
Oh, well, thanks very much.
Wrote a rave Amazon review about it.
I remember, that was kind of you. Well, this painting has, actually in the center of the painting, someone in a white, Middle Eastern garment. He's got his hands outstretched. He's looking expectantly as if he's demanding an answer from someone who's crouching on the ground, who's in the only colored garment in the picture, in a sort of blue Middle Eastern garment, who's crouching, and with his finger is, well, we know from the title of the painting, which is Writing in the Dust, that he's writing in the dust. But rather remarkably, this figure in the middle is wearing dark glasses.
Hmm.
And you think, well, did they wear dark glasses in those days? And of course, what Roger's wanting to do is to bring this story into the contemporary world, because on the right-hand side of the picture, there's a woman whose face is only just visible under her clothing, but it looks as if she's in great anguish, both from her facial expression and from her non-verbal language of her body. And the picture is called Writing in the Dust because it's of a story that comes in John's Gospel, where there was a woman who had been caught in an extramarital act. And according to some interpretations of the Jewish law, in a case like that, the woman should be killed by throwing stones at her. And actually, on the right-hand side at the back, there are some people who are about to throw stones at her, but there are also people with their smartphones taking pictures of it. And actually, there's a TV camera on the left of the picture. And there's some people in the foreground with their smartphones and their rifles. And what Roger's wanting to do is to use this modern technology to bring the story into our world so that we relate to it. It's not just a story printed on India paper in old Bibles, but it's relevant to us today. And in some Bibles, the story, which they have headings, the story is given a heading, The Woman Taken in Adultery. And Roger wrote a poem to, after he'd done the painting, and the poem is entitled The Men Taken in Hypocrisy.
Mm.
But the poem is all about how Jesus transforms this woman's life with a word of grace to her. Of course, he first of all asks, the people, like this man in the center in the white garment, is saying, Moses said she should be stoned. What do you say? And not for the first time, he's trying to trick Jesus. Because either answer, either saying, well, yes, she should be stoned, or you don't need to take any notice of what Moses said.
Right.
Would be an answer that would be inconsistent with Jesus' life and teaching. So instead, first of all, he writes in the dust, and then without answering. And then when they press him for an answer, he says, let the person here who's completely blameless themselves throw the first stone at her. And one by one, they melt away. And then he gives a word of grace to the woman. Go and start again. Don't repeat what you've done wrong.
Yeah.
It was wrong.
Yeah. But make a fresh start. And to me, it's such a powerful story and such a powerful painting and a very powerful poem about it. So I'd like you to read the poem that Roger wrote for this, because it's really touching.
There's a swallow in the picture, and there's a stone jar in the picture, and there's a whitewashed wall with the sun beating on it. So this is the men taken in hypocrisy. The beating of a swallow's wings, a stone jar poised as if to fall, a fierce and unforgiving sun that beats upon a whitewashed wall that finds and tracks each human flaw and reads the writing in the dust of broken hopes and powdered dreams and love reclassified as lust, where images of shameful death describe a life defined by blame. The beatings of a swallow's wings above a place of public shame are like the barest breath of grace that stir the unforgiving air, that shift the gaze and lead the eye beyond the camera's fateful stare to where one writes in grit and dust of dry bones in a bone-dry place of broken hopes and powdered dreams, the unseen, unhoped words of grace which free accuser and accused, which spell out where that life begins. a motion like a breath of grace, the beating of a swallow's wings.
There's two lines that jump out at me in that poem. One of them is a life defined by blame. And shame and blame are reverse flourishing. We pull in, we protect ourselves, we become less. And then the other line was shift the gaze. And so to me, this is a poem also about flourishing.
Yes, I think that's right. There's a very distinguished psychiatrist in Nassau in the Bahamas called David Allen, who finds that time and again people's mental illnesses, their needs for the sort of help that as a professional psychiatrist he can give. But the heart of it is shame, sense of shame, the self that they're ashamed of. And he seeks to, often in his therapy, he seeks to try to shift them from this self that they're ashamed of to their true self. And he's a professional psychiatrist. He has clients from all sorts of backgrounds, but for those who are believers, their true self is to be found in God's love for them. You are my beloved son. I'm absolutely delighted with you, is God's attitude to us. And I think that, there's another thing that Roger subtly slips into this, a fierce and unforgiving son. So the son's unforgiving, yeah, but those men standing around her are not too forgiving either.
Yeah.
And people sometimes ask in the book on human flourishing, what other things would I now add if we were making the book longer? Well, I think the book's the right length, so I don't think we should add anything, but an element that could be strengthened in the relationships side is forgiveness. And you may know that I do work in quantum computing, and a real breakthrough in quantum computing was made by one of the co-authors in It Keeps Me Seeking, Andrew Steen. It had been thought hitherto that you could not have error correction in a quantum computer. There were good technical reasons to do with something called the no cloning theorem. And that, because quantum bits are very susceptible to corruption, that meant it was never going to be practical to build a quantum computer. And Andrew showed how you could get around that problem. And despite what hitherto had been thought, you could do fault-tolerant error correction. And that really transformed the whole feasibility of building quantum computers. Now, if you like, that's a sort of metaphor for what we need in human relationships. We make mistakes, just like quantum bits.
Yeah.
We're liable to get things wrong. We're liable to get defaced and so on. And we do hurt each other. And, for those who see it this way, we hurt God. And you need a mechanism for dealing with that. And the mechanism for fault-tolerant error correction in relationships is called forgiveness. And it can be very hard to do, can be very hard to forgive, it can be very hard to accept forgiveness. But it's absolutely essential to human flourishing. We can't flourish without it. And I remember not so long ago, a colleague whose wife had cheated on him in a way that was very hurtful. And he said, I can never forgive her for that. Well, I didn't say it at the time because it was too painful, but I thought to myself, well, that's a choice that you make. And there are various metaphors in various cultures. In China, I think they say that resentment is like trying to hurt your enemy by picking up a burning coal to throw at them. Desmond Tutu quoted an African saying, which is that resentment or unforgiveness, he worked on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is like drinking poison and hoping your enemy will die.
Yeah.
So, this element of forgiveness is absolutely integral to human flourishing. And I think Roger picks up on it very subtly by talking about the sun as being unforgiving.
Yeah. Well, so let's bring this full circle, because you have that sign at Cavendish Lab, which, especially in the interpretation that you like, is the scientist taking joy
Yes.
in not only the discovery, but in the relationship with his creator.
Yes.
Now, we could contrast it to, there's also science done where everybody's ready to pick up stones and throw at you.
Yes.
Both you and I have written things where you get one thing wrong, it's over. Like, if you get like this paper or this book or whatever, if you screw up one thing, you will get impaled. It's like you're just like the woman in that scene. And it may occasionally be possible to write a book or a paper that doesn't have any mistakes. But when you get to do science in an environment where people give you the benefit of the doubt, and where there's grace and forgiveness for making a mistake, everybody breathes so much easier and so much more gets done. And people have the luxury of being so much less defensive. And it seems to me that that's what it takes for science to flourish. I mean, God knows we got enough unsolved problems that are staring us in the face. If it could be a little less perilous to work on those problems, maybe we could all flourish a little more.
We've got to have the freedom to make mistakes. We've got to have the freedom to try things out and see what works and what doesn't work. We've got to have the freedom to test everything and select what, in the light of that, proves to be worthwhile.
Yes, which St. Paul said very well a long time ago.
In his letter to Timothy, test everything.
Hold to what is good.
That's right.
Well, thank you. This has been great.
Terry, I've enjoyed this conversation. I always enjoy conversations with you, and today especially. Thank you.
Pleasure.